I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk says peace talks to end the war in Ukraine could begin this winter, we ask if it was wise for Ukrainian officials to say that even if the US cuts aid to the country, they have enough money and weapons to resist Russia until mid-2025.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 11th of December, 2 years and 297 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by former tank unit commander and chemical, biological and nuclear weapons expert, Hamish de Bretton Gordon. I started with the latest news from the front line. Russian attacks across Ukraine killed at least 8 civilians, injured almost 60 others across the whole country yesterday. The vast majority of the casualties were in Zaporizhia after an attack late last night killed 7, injured 22, when a clinic was destroyed and about 20 residential buildings nearby were damaged. Then in Kyiv Oblast, the town of Zlatopil was hit with 2 Iskander-M missiles, according to officials. 16 residential buildings damaged there, 17 people injured. Now, Ukrainian forces allegedly struck based at Taganrog inside Russia, the Russian city right in the northeast corner of the Sea of Azov. It damaged critical infrastructure, local Russian officials claimed. There are various videos on social media showing a number of explosions that occurred around 3:30 a.m. local time. Russian sources are now saying that it was the Taganrog aviation, scientific and technical complex that was hit by drones and missiles. This is about 150 k's from the front line. I mentioned that because there is some speculation as to whether or not it was an attack with US-supplied ATACMS missiles. Now, separately, Ukrainian forces also hit the Druzhba oil loading pipeline. That's been hit before. This is near the city of Bryansk, so north of Ukrainian Bryansk Oblast, starting a fire there. That came from General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. Russian authorities said that their air defences had shot down 14 drones over the region during that attack. Now, elsewhere in the country, interesting things happening today. Ukrainian police are said to have carried out a number of searches at Ukrainian railway premises in and around Kyiv, the city and the oblast, this morning over a suspected criminal scheme being run by a group of the company's officials. The railway employees are suspected of corruption and of earning illicit gains by manipulating tickets offered for international travel. Now, police statements said the actions of the defendants led to significant losses and the creation of an artificial shortage of tickets for the most popular routes on the market. And then Ukrainian Railways put out a statement saying searches and seizures of material evidence, along with hearings and detentions, are being conducted. We know that searches have been taking place in offices, homes and elsewhere. Just as a side note, over 600 railway employees have been killed since the start of the full-scale invasion. I mention that because it's in the news. It's yet another clampdown on alleged corruption. But also our experience here from the Telegraph trying to get in and out of the country has been not so straightforward when we are booking these train tickets. You have to basically book from inside the country, or at least have a Ukrainian bank account in order to process the transaction. So we have to rely on friends and colleagues and what have you in country at the time to actually book these tickets for us. They're not, amazingly, they're very, very cheap. But I think the reason that we are not able to buy from outside the country is a clampdown on these, on alleged this sort of fraudulent activity whereby criminal groups would buy up thousands of the tickets and then run it all on the black market. But I just wonder if our experience does reflect some of these attempts to clamp down on these schemes. Now, elsewhere, Ukraine's Ombudsman Dmytro Natalukha, speaking on national television yesterday, said that Russian forces executed at least 109 Ukrainian prisoners of war this year, in 2024. He added that 177 cases of prisoners of war executions were confirmed during the previous years of the full-scale, or what he called the full-scale war. But basically, since February 24th, 2022, there have been 177 cases, PW executions that Mr. Lubinets is looking into, and a further 109 this year. So the rate is going up. Now, on the diplomatic front, quite a few moves of interest. Firstly, Vladimir Putin met with India's Defence Minister Rajnath Singh in Moscow yesterday. India is treading a very fine line between trying to keep close enough to Russia to benefit from cheap oil and other bits and pieces, whilst, as we've reported recently and others have as well, trying to move away from the old Russian and Soviet military equipment. You may remember Bloomberg reported last week that India has sharply reduced its defence equipment orders from Russia, shifting the purchase of equipment to Western suppliers. Now, the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, say that Minister Singh announced the commissioning of a Russian-produced Krivat-class frigate for the Indian Navy yesterday. It's being built at the Yantar shipbuilding plant in Kaliningrad Oblast. He made that announcement on Monday. Now, the Indian Navy already has 6 similar ships. 3 were delivered by 2004, 3 more in 2012. And also the Indian outlet, the Sunday Guardian, said last Sunday, in fact, that India and Russia are finalising a deal for India to buy a Russian-made early warning radar system said to have a range of about 6,000 kilometres, which the ISW assesses probably a Voronezh radar. So India's still playing it cute, but an interesting position. I mention this because it's news, but also we do keep an eye on the diplomatic moves there from India. Now, onto the sort of title for today. Ukraine's finance minister, Serhiy Marchenko, said in an interview that's published today in France's El Pays newspaper that Ukraine has enough funds and ammunition to continue resisting Russia at least throughout the first half of 2025, even if US assistance dries up. So Mr. Marchenko said, I believe that we have enough funds, enough weapons, missiles and artillery shells to resist at least during the first half of 2025. This means that at least during the first half of the year and beyond, we will be well equipped to resist this aggression. Now, I think it's a pretty bold statement. He might be right. Now, if he is right, fine, great, but things can change rapidly. But what if he's wrong? The optics of Ukraine suddenly having to ask for more stuff, if they realise that that is an incorrect statement, would not be good. And regardless, just the fact that he's said it will bolster the argument coming from some people, some of whom are around President-elect Donald Trump, that say that Ukraine doesn't need continued support, US aid and other aid should be cut off. So I think it's an interesting intervention. I just wonder if this is part of a strategy that Ukraine has decided to adopt, possibly one that's described to Donald Trump when President Zelensky met him last week in Paris for the Notre Dame reopening. Maybe there's some saying this to try and mollify and placate some of these people around Trump. I don't know, but I think it's an interesting intervention. What do you think? It comes as Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, said peace talks to end the war in Ukraine could begin this winter. Mr. Tusk made the comments ahead of talks with Volodymyr Zelensky in Warsaw, and just as Poland is about to take up the 6-month rotating presidency of the EU. He was speaking to reporters yesterday, and Mr. Tusk said, our EU presidency will notably be co-responsible for what the political landscape will look like, perhaps how the situation will look during peace negotiations, which could begin, though there are still question marks, in the winter of this year. I really want Poland to be the country that will not only be present, but will set the tone for these decisions that are to bring us security and secure Polish interests. Now, speaking of Poland, President Macron of France is going to fly to Poland tomorrow. He's expected to discuss this issue of potential peace negotiations with Mr. Tusk. And we are told that discussion could well include talk of peacekeeping missions in Ukraine. Now, we've spoken before about one of the possible models for a peace is a Korean scenario, i.e. there's no firm security guarantees like Article 5, but you put a huge foreign contingent, reported in some of the Polish media, of up to 40,000 soldiers. I should clarify those figures of 40,000 soldiers. That comes from analysts quoted in the Polish media, not from the French or the Polish governments. Now, the outlet Rzeczpospolita, the Polish media outlet, are suggesting there could be 5 brigades. Poland could command one of them. However, as a friend of the pod and our colleague Shashank Joshi of The Economist said, that If it's 40,000, that's larger than all NATO forward deployments in Eastern Europe, and with enablers would hugely tax the allies. Shashank says that's a big ask and probably impossible without significant US assistance. But I think it's just very interesting that this talk of the models. Do you go for a Korean model where you have a lot of troops camped on the territory? Do you go for a sort of West Germany, East Germany model whereby West Germany joins NATO, even as East Germany was not a unified nation? So does that mean that Ukraine could be admitted to NATO even while circa 17% of the country is under Russian control? Or do you go for the so-called porcupine or Taiwan strategy, whereby no formal guarantees, but you just arm it to the teeth so that it is a very, very prickly target to try and swallow? Interesting that these models are being discussed. Interesting that some numbers are starting to be put on it. And very interesting, I think, that Donald Tusk, with the chair of the EU's rotating presidency, is going to sort of pick the ball up and run with it, I think. Anyway, turning to our guest, delighted to have you back. There are differing views on the threat Russia poses at the moment. Some people are saying it's inconceivable that Russia would suddenly try and roll over NATO's borders. I am inclined to agree with that, but it doesn't have to be one or it's not binary. What if there was a manufactured outrage among the Russian minority population in, say, Estonia, that then saw Russian civic leaders arrive without visas to calm down the situation? Would that be an immediate NATO Article 5? Probably not. What if they were then, what would be the reaction of the Estonian police and riot police and so on and so forth? So a lot of talk about the threat Russia poses to NATO. There was an event yesterday at Chatham House, the international affairs think tank here in London, that was titled Safeguarding Europe, How to Defeat and Deter Russia. It was live streamed. It's on their YouTube channel. So we're not breaking any Chatham House rules here by talking about it. But I'd be interested in your views on what came out of that event, and also the British Chief of Defence Staff's reach at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute think tank, that also talked about, he said, a very low chance that Russia would directly just attack a NATO member by rolling over the borders. But like I say, there's a lot short of that they could do. Would it be more like Ukraine 2014 than Ukraine 2022, and how NATO would deal with that? Anyway, Hamish, what did you take from the event and CDS's speech, and how do you think this will play out in the international circles?
Well, thanks very much for having me on, Dom, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm sure a lot of people expect me to speak about Syria, and I will in my final thoughts. But what we're discussing now is not completely unrelated. I think, it is very interesting. There are a lot of important people going to various think tanks like Chatham House and RUSI, setting out their stall, as it were. And we have President Trump about to take command on the 20th of January next month, who thinks that people in NATO are not pulling their weight, or people in European NATO are not pulling their weight and not spending what they should do on defence. So I think the talk yesterday from the Lithuanian acting Foreign Minister, Gabrielius Landsberg, was very interesting. It strikes me that the closer you are to Russia, the greater you perceive the threat. And I suppose that is not unnatural. And certainly his line is very, very much that Russia is a threat that we've got to wade off. You then put it against what CDS Admiral Radkin, I almost called him General Radkin for the moment, but there we go, said at RUSI at the beginning of this month, that we were in a third nuclear age. But there was only a remote possibility that Russia would attack us directly. And that idea was actually also reiterated by John Foreman, the former naval officer and former DA in Moscow, really backing up what CDS had said, and also said it was, as you said in the intro there, Dom, it was a very remote possibility that Russia would attack NATO, and anyway, NATO vastly overmatched. I think then I've looked at a bit wider. John Healey, our Defence Secretary, really talking about the military that the new government inherited from the last government, that it really need a lot of sorting out and a lot of working out, but not promising any great increase in expenditure. And then Al Kearns, the Veterans Minister, who was a squaddy like you and me, Dom, although he was a a Marine, same sort of thing, suggesting that the British Army would only last 6 to 12 months. And when you look at the conflict in Ukraine with Russia that's been going on well over 2 years, there just sort of seem to be an imbalance. Now, of course, we have the Strategic Defence Review that is going on at the moment, and I think it's being kept fairly tight. And it strikes me that there is, I'm sure, like you, Dom, lots of people whisper things in your ears, but it would appear that maybe we're being set up for nothing is going to change, whatever the Strategic Defence Review comes out with, that actually spending 2% or 2% on defence is what we can afford and really what we need, because the Russians are not quite the threat that the Lithuanians, the people in the Baltics and the Poles sort of think. And I think that is strikes me as being a pretty dangerous position to be in, because an awful lot is perception. And I go back to, I've written many times, when Putin looked west on the 24th of February 2022, he didn't really see anything that really concerned him. But now, after his ignominious booting out of Syria, the cracks are beginning to show. And I think the last thing we should be doing at the moment is really showing any weakness and suggesting that we have an army that would only last 6 months in the field. Just really strikes the wrong chord for me. So I think a lot of interesting things, that there's a lot of posturing going on, but it seems that those who would shout for the government, the British government, are very strongly suggesting that actually we're probably on track, we're probably spending enough money, and that slightly concerns me. Maybe we're spending it in the wrong sort of place, and maybe the Strategic Defence Review will come out. But I think, although Assad has had his Waterloo, whether Putin is going to get his Waterloo, as it were, in the coming months, it's really going to be determined, I think, by obviously the Ukrainians in the first instant, by what support we give them to enable them to achieve that. And if we don't, a lot of what was said by Admiral Radkin in Rusi and others are saying is slightly off the mark. So that is my area of concern. I hope we put that in a succinct enough and short nutshell. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. Now, from your area of concern to your area of expertise, if I may, and apologies for leaping around, but as I say, this is going to be a shorter live version because we've got the long interview on the podcast later. But the Washington Post are reporting that Ukraine supplied Syrian rebels with drones and experienced operators in the weeks leading up to defeating Assad's army. Now, you've got a lot of experience in Syria. We've not got a huge amount of time now to get into all of that, but what's your take on the Washington Post story, and what's your reaction to events in Syria this week?
Well, first of all, absolutely amazing. I could, as you can imagine, talk all day on that. First of all, is that plausible? Well, it's no secret that I did a lot of work in Syria in the medical community and working with my friend James Lemessurier with the White Helmets, who were the people who were digging people out of bomb buildings and generally saving a lot of lives. Now, a number of White Helmets went to Ukraine to advise Ukraine how to set up a similar type of emergency services, particularly about how you dig people out of bomb buildings, how you try and avoid hospitals getting bombed and all that sort of things. So I know certainly that there were Syrians who went to Ukraine to help out. And as you know, once you do that sort of thing, particularly in warfare, you build up a bond. So it wouldn't be at all surprising to me that people go both ways. And as you said, there is very clear evidence that the rebels were using drones to great effect. And I find it rather ironic that Putin developed his sort of playbook in Syria of attacking hospitals, schools, and attacking civilians, which he then replicated in Ukraine. So a sort of rough justice coming back there. But the speed of what happened in Syria is remarkable. I think it's because the rebels were obviously well trained, obviously professional. I last saw them in 2020. Now, I saw Al-Qaeda and ISIS back in 2013, and they were absolutely to be avoided. In 2020, my last visit, and HTS, they were sort of working alongside us in the sort of medical support fraternity, but they were a bit ragtag. In the last 4 years, somebody has trained them very well, and they're a pretty professional outfit. And the thing I'd say is this was a public uprising. So, of course, HTS are jihadists, and do leopards change their spots, etc., etc. Who knows? Time will tell. I mean, the other area that, of course, people are desperately concerned of is Assad's chemical weapons and the remains of. I understand the Israelis have done a comprehensive job, or pretty good job, of destroying a lot of that, but that is still a concern that potentially will fall into other hands. But all my Syrian friends, either in Syria or out of Syria, are pretty upbeat, and I hope that remains, because the other thing that it shows, the Russians scuttled away. This was a big defeat for Russia, without a shadow of a doubt, and Iran as well. And as you all know, as anybody knows who is either been in conflict or from a sporting analogy, once you get somebody on the run, that is the time to strike and really kick hard. So I hope that will happen in Ukraine, because this can't be kept from the Russian people. They're already beginning to talk about it and how things have gone desperately wrong. Hopefully it will have a positive effect all round, and we will just have to see how the new administration in Syria work. It's got to be a Syrian solution, an Arab solution, but we in the West and around the world have a lot to do, giving them resources and the wherewithal to rebuild what was a fantastic country, and I hope it will be in future.
Thanks, Hamish. Just 2 points before we quickly wrap up. Because you mentioned them, you talk about the white helmets, and you then move swiftly on to military assistance to the rebels. And because there are people that will try and conflate the two, and there's a lot of Russian disinformation talking about the work that James Lemez, my friend as well, got up to, and the white helmets, and they're very keen to portray the white helmets as a military actor, as an organisation. So I just wonder if you could absolutely clarify that, please, and put your opinion on the clear blue water between the work the white helmets did, pause, full stop, and then the assistance given to rebels, because I do not believe the white helmets provide lethal assistance, but that's me, and people won't believe me. And because you introduced those ideas, I just ask you to tidy that bit up. And then secondly and finally, you talked about the chemical and possibly biological weapons in the Syrian arsenal. How secure do you think they can be? Do you think there's assistance needed now from external supporters or external countries to try and get in there to secure and remove, destroy, and what have you, the stockpiles that are left?
Yeah, a really good point in the white helmets, Dom. And if I was not clear, then that is really my bad. Absolutely, the white helmets, emergency services, people who, providing ambulance service, digging people out, helping people, absolutely nothing at all to do with anything military. And I worked with them for many, many years and never saw anything like that. And what they were helping with in Ukraine was emergency services. The element to the drones, obviously people use drones to try and find people in rubble. When it comes to any activities of HTS and drones, then it wouldn't have come from the white helmets. These are absolutely civilians, and I've never met one who had any militant or background. So I think that we'll absolutely put that to bed. And they are very dear to my heart, as is James too. On the chemical weapons side, this is a big issue. When the people might remember back in August, 21st of August, 2013, Assad dropped about half a ton or so of nerve agent sarin on a place called Ghouta. There's a very good write-up on it at the moment on the BBC website, because there are survivors there now who are telling their story. That precipitated, there is a vote in Parliament, which I've written about for the paper, and hopefully it will be published this afternoon. And unfortunately, despite my best efforts, because I'd just come back from Syria, the British government voted not to destroy Assad's chemical weapons program. And in my opinion, that kept him in power for the next 11 years. But the Assad regime did declared that they had about 1,500 tons of chemical weapons, mainly precursors. Now, I and others who knew about these things reckon that was probably about 25% of what they actually had, maybe 30%. Therefore, there was an awful lot left, and he continued to use it. As of today, it is clear that it's probably precursors. And what I mean by precursors, in order to create a chemical weapon, you mix different chemicals together at the sort of last minute to provide this really toxic mix that you then use. So it's likely that until a few days ago, there were maybe a few hundred tons of these precursors. There might be a bit of mustard gas, which again, Assad used quite a lot of. It is public knowledge that the Israelis have been hitting a lot of military targets in Syria hard, and they have been hitting a lot of these chemical weapon targets, facilities, mainly in the south of the country. And there may be still a few of the research institutions, establishments that haven't yet been hit. And blowing this stuff up might sound a bit crude, but it's a pretty good way of getting rid of chemical weapons. There, of course, is there's an issue with collateral damage, there's an issue with contamination, but actually if you blow up a nerve agent, you pretty much destroy it. But it will need to be verified. So the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, I am sure, are producing contingency plans when the situation allows, that they can go in and verify that all these things are being destroyed. The concern that ISIS and other extreme jihadist groups might get hold of some of this stuff is well founded. And I think the way the Americans have also been targeting ISIS in the east of Syria is probably the right way to try and minimize the chance of this happening. So I would judge now most of the Assad chemical weapons have been now destroyed or made unfunctional, but it will be, one would want to see the Organisation, the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, get in there and verify it. They'll, of course, need force protection to do that. And once that's done, I think we can rest a little bit easier in our beds, as it were.
Francis has been speaking to Ukrainian MP Dmytro Natalukha, the chair of the Economic Affairs Committee, 37-year-old rising star in President Zelensky's party. So for final thoughts, I'll go first if I may. I'd just like to say thanks to Minnie. I only know Minnie as Grasshopper Mouse. Yeah, sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? But thank you, Minnie Grasshopper Mouse, for the stickers I received today of my NAFO fella. They are perfect stocking fillers, as you say, and already, because he's not in the office today, plastered all over Francis's desk. So thank you very much for those stickers. Hamish, final thoughts, please.
Well, my final thought is, it is not unsurprising to do with Syria. That, we are one tyrant down. The world has proved that these tyrants do not live forever, do not exist forever, and they are movable. And it's proved also that, again, Putin is not immune to military defeat, and we should bear that in mind. And I hope that particularly European NATO countries, including our own, take this opportunity while Putin is reeling from his defeat in Syria to ensure that Ukraine can prevail and get into a good place to negotiate the ceasefire that we're all praying and hoping will follow shortly after President Trump takes command in 5 or 6 weeks' time.
While in Kyiv last month, Francis Dearnley sat down with Ukrainian Member of Parliament Dmytro Natalukha, a rising star in Zelensky's party. At 37 years old, he is currently chairman of the Economic Affairs Committee. After gaining a degree in law at the University of Kyiv, he did a master's degree at Cambridge in grand strategy. In a wide-ranging and thoughtful interview, you'll hear his view on the topics of the moment, such as negotiations, and why he thinks the South Korean model, sometimes touted, is flawed. But also you'll hear in far greater detail about the Ukrainian economy and its future. the impact of corruption, and even how language itself has become a tool of war. First, Dmytro begins by giving his perspective on the impact of the granting of weapons permissions for Ukraine to strike inside Russia as winter approaches.
It is very important, especially in the upcoming months of winter, and knowing that Russians are preparing to bomb our energy infrastructure. It might be, in a way, a deterrent, in a certain way, for the Russians, to be very careful in what they're doing, because right now they don't care. They're just bombarding and covering everything they can reach simply because they can, and they have no feeling of being at risk, no feeling of having a threat to their capabilities. So for us, it's an opportunity to clearly move the line from where they can lift their airplanes and their bombers.
Missiles, though, it would appear, from what we understand, are limited in where they can be fired, i.e. they can be used in the Kursk region where Ukrainian forces still are. What is your feeling about the purpose behind the Kursk incursion?
So this gave a huge boost to the Ukrainian morale. First point. Second point, it has proved in a way something very interesting, that the Ukrainians are still able to surprise and make significant advances even without a considerable advantage in terms of weapons. We did that without having the storm shadows, without having the ATACMS, without having the permission to do deep strikes. So that was pure military tactics and pure military strategy that has completely taken the Russians by surprise, proving again that we can still do it. We are capable of showing success on the battlefield. We just need instruments. Imagine how much more successful that operation would be if we would have what we need at that time. Third, I think that from the standpoint of potential negotiations or potential bargains, it's still, to be honest, a pain in the back of the Russians, because every time you have to justify how come the Ukrainian army still controls a strip of the Russian territory and not kicking them out. So this was humiliating for Putin in the beginning. And the longer it takes them to basically squeeze the Ukrainians out of there, the harder it is for them to explain to their own population why the almighty Russian army cannot free their own territory, instead of going around somewhere on the territory which does not belong to them.
One of the reasons why we've come here to Kyiv is to gauge, following on from Trump's election victory, the mood here regarding the subject of the possibility of upcoming peace negotiations or talks. Are you ready personally to see Ukraine enter those talks?
Again, to be able to fully comprehend, your question, I would probably need to understand the capability we have in terms of the military resources. I have to literally know and understand the military capabilities that we are still that are still at our disposal, which I don't.
Do you think that's common in the parliament for MPs not to have a full?
In a way, we're not supposed to. We have a high profile understanding of those things. We have some better understanding in specific areas, or like, for instance, and for example, my committee oversees the industry, right, and the industrial production. So I kind of understand the output of the Ukrainian industrial sector, but that doesn't mean that I understand what is the situation literally is like somewhere in Kherson, or for instance, the situation with Pokrovsk. Right. So Pokrovsk, from the economic perspective, I do understand that it's one of the biggest Ukrainian reserves of coking coal. Is it called like coking coal?
Coal, yeah.
No, but it's a specific kind of coal,
Yeah.
Is it called coking?
Coke is what we would call, they have certain aspects of coal production.
Right. So the one is that is used in the metallurgy, right? So, so I understand, for instance, that the fall of Pokrovsk potentially would be catastrophic for the Ukrainian metallurgy. But again, from the military standpoint, I don't know, things like that. So I would tell you that, my answer would be that we are capable to carry on.
When you say capable, do you mean militarily? Do you mean in terms of morale? Do you mean economically? Can you break that down for me?
Economically, we are. It is getting harder and harder, but still, I mean, at the same time, we're not staying in the very same place. We're developing, we're evolving ourselves. So starting with the situation in 2022, we never had even one industrial plant that produces bullets, for instance, for the AKs. Now we are talking about a number of them being opened around the world and in Ukraine. And the same goes for the 155 caliber and so on and so forth. So there is this evolution as much as there is an incredible evolution of the mil-tech industry in terms of drones, the radio intelligence systems, and then radio jamming systems, and so on and so forth. And during the deficit of ammo for the artillery in the beginning of this year, when there was this problem with the American Congress hesitating to provide us the military aid, we have had some precedents when specific sectors of the front line was deterred from our side exclusively by drones. And that wasn't just one day, it was happening for like a week, couple of weeks. And that allowed us to understand that drones alone sometimes can replace artillery, can replace infantry. And if we scale them to a specific number, of course, in the end, you would always need physical operators, but that until you get the development of the AI enough so that you can operate multiple drones at the same time and not just one. And that is somewhere where we're going, not just us, unfortunately, the Russians as well. But so the logic I'm trying to show is that technologically, I think that we can get there, and it might be even shorter than everyone thinks. The problem is that we need to withstand a specific amount of time. And for that, we need resources right now, because the development and the progress in the mil-tech industry was absolutely astonishing. Was skyrocketing in terms of technologies and everything. So going back to your question, yes, I think that we can still withstand this war, and that we can still hold our ground. We can still recapture back our ground.
All of it?
Huh?
All of it?
Again, depending on the resources. I mean, take the Kharkiv offensive, take the Kherson offensive. We have never had any superiority in terms of manpower on our side. Technologically, probably, but it was tactical success, a matter of military surprise, a matter of smart logistics, a matter of being able to use specific instruments like HIMARSs and stuff like this in a very specific way, so that the Russians are being inflicted an incredible amount of damage. When we know what is at our disposal, we can use the cards that we need, right? So for the moment, it's not like that. We have this deficit. And for that reason, it's really hard to answer your question in terms of how and when and so on and so forth. So as soon as we understand what cards do we have in play, basically that would be much easier.
I'm not going to ask you to be an armchair general in the sense of being an expert on the military position, but you must, as an elected representative, have a sense of the mood of those you represent in the country as to whether there is even the prospect of people being willing to accept Ukrainian officials sitting down with Russian ones. You must have a sense as to whether that is conceivable. Whether that's right or wrong, you must know.
Francis, don't get me wrong. I think that basically in the end, every war ends with negotiations. The difference is whether that is a capitulation or you have some negotiation. So I would say that we are very, 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 very far from capitulation. I don't hear any discussions about this. I wouldn't even use that word.
No discussions in the parliament at all that are akin to
No, absolutely not. No. And I mean, I'm here coming from the parliament right away. So no. People there, they are tired, of course. That I wouldn't lie. People are getting tired, but it's natural again. Because in a way, it's a matter of your psychological perception of this new realities that you're into. And some people have managed to accept it. Some people are still struggling because it's not really easy to realize that basically you are living under a constant threat of being hit by a drone, even if you're not at the front line. You hardly can leave the country. Your business is very, very vulnerable in terms of potential risks of being destroyed. You have restrictions connected with capital. You have restrictions connected with liquidity. You have restrictions connected with your personal movement and so on and so forth. So those are the conditions in which Ukrainian business and Ukrainian people operate for 3 years already, almost 3 years. The trick here is whether you are expecting those conditions to change soon, and you plan for them to be changed, and you plan for them to be altered, and you're building some plans and you're building some strategy for yourself, or you just accept it as the new reality you're into and the circumstances that you cannot influence, and you just have to operate within those, those new parameters. In a way, a book that helped me very much was a book regarding on the experience of people who have been in the Nazi concentration camps, because there has been three categories of people. The first one who were sure they will be free tomorrow, or just in a couple of days, like the day after tomorrow in a week. Those people psychologically have collapsed, like almost immediately. Because when you have this expectation, it's very high, then realizing it's not happening, it's really damaging. Then the second group was literally trying to plan something. They were strategizing, so the Russians will come, and then the Brits will come, and now America will get into the war. And then I've heard that some army was moving somewhere in that location, and so on and so forth. Those were so-so. They basically had a hard time, but not as much as the first one. And the third group who basically accepted, like, this is our new life. This is our new coordinates. This is our new parameters. We cannot influence them. We cannot do anything with that. We just have to accept it and exist, trying to survive and trying to make our life as miserable as possible within these conditions. And are we ready to die within these conditions? Probably yes, but at least let's have this life to be as happy as possible, even if we are just, limited to this precise conditions. So I think that we're in a transition in a way from the second to the third kind of category. And if you are still stuck in the first group, then you're having problems, because this is not the longest war by far. So like, the Second World War was 39-45. This is approaching to 3 years. And I mean, in a way, we're not some special snowflakes. This is a very brutal war. It is very heartbreaking to talk to people, hear the personal tragedies, hear the personal dramas. I have lost some friends myself, but in the end of the day, I do realize that this is a war as much as any other war. We just have to cope with it. We just have to, brace ourselves and just learn how to stay strong within this parameters, and how to carry on, so that in the end we are victorious.
Now, I will promise come to economics in a minute, because this is, of course, a crucial area that you have expertise on that perhaps is underappreciated quite often, although we do cover it as much as we can in our own work. But I just wanted to ask you, first of all, you're talking about the subject of negotiations and the prospect of a future beyond the war. Of course, an element of that would be the end of martial law and elections. And I've heard rumours that there are some MPs in the parliament that are saying, we need to start thinking seriously about 2025 being the year where we have elections. Have you heard those rumors? And second, what does that mean for Ukraine and for President Zelensky himself, your party leader?
He made it absolutely clear that until the martial law is lifted, there is no elections. So I think that he is very much focused on ending this war with a just peace for Ukraine. Because in a way, I think that the current establishment, both the president, the parliament, and the government, they don't want to leave a debt of war to the next generation and the next convocation and the next president whatsoever. So this is, I think that the last thing we all want is this war to become something we're just passing over to someone else, now you deal with it. Because that's just irresponsible. And I think that would mean that we haven't done our job well.
But that is one of the prospects that's being at least talked about, given the Trump victory, that we might see a situation where the deal on the table, as it were, is that many of the territories in the East are lost to Russia. I mean, if that was put before you and there were, let's say, adequate, from your perspective, security guarantees for Ukraine, that Ukraine can get that investment, it can breathe out, the war stops, could you vote for that?
I think even the president mentioned that there might be a case when we will have to outlive people in the Kremlin to get all of the territories back. The thing is that we're never denying our call to get those territories, so we're not refusing our right to them, right? But precisely with this government in Russia, with this leadership, the current leadership in Russia, there might be a new leadership who would say, listen, okay, let's rearrange. I totally get it. This was a stupid thing to do. Okay, can we renegotiate? So the word I was looking for is claim. So we're not refusing our claim to those territories. If we still realize a world in which Russia will be governed by Putin and can become a partner in trade, commerce, or whatsoever of the EU, of UK, of whoever else, again, with him being still the leader of Russia, I think that's a massive fail. It's a failure beyond imagination, to be honest. And for the same reason that us, the Balts, the Poles, the Slovaks, probably will not feel ourselves safe. And I think that is the reason why the president emphasized this aspect of outliving someone. But also, this gets back to your question on would I vote for it if I had some security guarantees. The problem is, until Putin is in power in Russia, I don't think there might be a security guarantee for Ukraine that will be enough for us to basically say, yeah, now we're safe. Now we feel safe. Even with NATO, because right now we're talking about getting the membership without the application of the fifth article, right? So, I mean, I don't think that might be a deterrent for Putin to try and to attempt to invade Ukraine again in 7 years, 10 years, right? So that is critical. That is critical, and that is why we're so concerned on who will be the person with whom we might be negotiating on the Russian side.
Fascinating. Thank you. Well, let's turn then to your special subject, economics. How do you assess the way in which this war has transformed the Ukrainian economy, good and bad? Before
I go there, I just want to get back one last time to the previous question and just give you an example of North Korea. Because for a lot of times I've heard this argument that you should use the Korean example. Like the Korean settlement was something that
South Korean,
right? Yeah, you should pay attention to. And just to remind you and the audience, the South Korean settlement was about drawing a line on where the front line terminated. So it's not some territories that is specified in some documents. No, just a line where there was a stalemate in a way. And then what happened is that the U.S. introduced the troops, 60,000 people, as a security guarantee to the South Korea. And that was it, basically. There was no ceasefire officially. There was nothing, like, it was just everything ended. And then South Korea carried on and started reconstructing itself. And here I see a very vulnerable spot in this narrative, because precisely because in North Korea there was no change of government as a result of this settlement. We now have not just a dictatorship somewhere in that region that might still be a menace to South Korea. We now have a dictatorship that owns nuclear weapons that is now threatening not just South Korea, but potentially the whole world. And this is precisely, in my opinion, the outcome of not changing a hostile government in your adversary's country. So that is why, again, I would like to make that point that for us and probably for the world to feel safe, we need to change the clique, the military clique, the aggressive clique that runs Russia right now. Now, going back to economics, I think that The resilience that we witnessed from the side of our private business was absolutely outstanding. In a way, a lot of people who moved outside of Ukraine, and I'm talking about some women, elderly people, they realized for the first time how great was the quality of life in Ukraine before the war. So we used to criticize our country a lot. We don't like this, we don't like that. But then when you move out and you understand that you're living in different conditions in a country where you basically have no right to say something in terms of changing it, because it's not your country, they're hosting you, they're doing you a favor, obviously. So you realize that it's very different from the things that you're used to, like starting from topping up your phone, ending up with getting a card in the bank, and then ordering a taxi or healthcare, women exactly complaining about beauty salons and stuff like that, taxi services, just couriers for food and elementary products, the quality of food, the quality of elementary products, the access to vegetables. And so I can go for quite a long time. But I remember myself, and with all my love and due respect to the UK, but opening a bank account there as an expat, that was something just beyond imagination. Like, here you can do it in an app, like within 6 hours probably. So a lot of stuff like that. And in a way that was thanks to our businesses, who managed to create a very comfortable and basically responsive infrastructure here within Ukraine. First aspect. Second aspect, in a way, we have learned that surprisingly, the shadow economy sometimes can be very useful, and I kid you not, this is a very counterintuitive observation that we have made in 2022. But the reality is that because people were used to hoard some assets and some cash and some money under the mattresses, those money helped them to carry on when the system was going down. So this is the second very, very interesting thing that we learned. You might take it as a joke, and we joke about it, but there is a piece of truth in it. Then we realized that basically having a border with the EU it matters a lot, even in terms of the movement of the goods, the movement of the services. I think that the economy, as soon as they started bombarding the ports and the railway logistical centers and hubs, basically the roads became a vital part of our trade and commerce for 1-2 years. And if we wouldn't have that huge market in the west of Ukraine, I think that would be a totally different outcome. Bad side of it is, in a way, when the government stepped back in the beginning and let the businesses do their things, that was like a push for everyone to get creative and innovative. Now that the government has returned in full scale at regulating specific public procurement and stuff like that, it became harder again. And the problem is that only now we are starting to realize how specific instruments that we considered as something granted, like public procurement again, can now become a full-scale driver of specific sectors and industries. So you literally direct an enormous flow of money into weapons production, and all of a sudden it's just growing like mushrooms.
So Keynesian economics approach.
There you go. So you can't leave Cambridge without learning Keynes. Of course, I'm guilty. This is something I've been pushing since probably the 2020. And I've been called a protectionist and a Keynesianist in a very bad way. But now what we're seeing is precisely the Keynesian models that works, pumping money in specific sectors to basically make it grow. The problem is, however, and this is also on the negative side, is our incredible dependence on international financial institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, because every time we're talking about pump priming, we're having a very hard time. People are very much worried with inflation, fair enough, but then again, it depends. To a certain level during wartime and with constraints like this, I think there's some space for more inflation to be positive, to be okay, if in return we can see a growth in specific sectors. So yeah, again, on the negative side, what we discovered is basically the EU, where we are going, is not keeping the same pace that we are. I mean, the dynamics of life is very different. The systems that we're trying to align with, in a way, is a product of some very peaceful times, and is developed for a very harmonic development in a very friendly surrounding. So it's very different from the situation we have now. We need something that is triple as faster as possible. Like, we don't need specific regulations, we don't need the specific limitations, but we hardly can change them. And that is why the good side, we started looking also on some different markets. So we're talking about the sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about Latin America, we're talking about the Indo-Pacific region and East and then East in general as potential markets for our export. So, I mean, it's always good and bad, I mean, of course, war is a tragedy. Of course, it's something you would rather not want to have at any cost because of the huge price you're paying with human lives. But if you want to use it as an opportunity, there's enough room for you to do that. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to take advantage of the opportunities this war, in a way, has provided.
Mm. And there are, as you say, many opportunities that we've discussed on the podcast previously. But I have to bring up the subject because, of course, the president does very often, which is economics and corruption. Mm. And I wonder if you can comment on the initiatives that have been made. Have they gone far enough? And do you think that corruption is something that is still systemic in Ukraine, as some critics say?
I mean, I can give you a long answer and a short answer. Which one you would prefer?
Well, it wouldn't be Ukraine-related if I said the short answer. So give me the long answer.
So the way I see corruption is, and why it exists in the Ukrainian society, is from the historical perspective. I mean, the problem with this land is that until 1991, it was governed mainly by different empires, including the Soviet Empire. The Soviet Union. We have had some periods of time when we had our own government, but in terms of history, it was like 6-7 years. So it was like a day, nothing. Now, when you have a government that you do not elect and that often is very hostile to you because he considers yourself as just mere resources, you use corruption as a medium to make someone on whom your life depends, but whom you cannot control, just not to, slay you in a way. Saying, listen, I understand you don't give a heck about me, but perhaps this will make you kinder to me and my problems. And the other outcome of this historical context is that there is a characteristic in our national identities that is, I think, probably the strongest, which is adaptivity. And precisely this helped us in developing that characteristic, because the necessity to adapt to different circumstances, to different governments, different empires, basically allowed us to survive on this territory. The negative side of it, of course, is that civilizations have been built around rules, and when you are focused on adaptivity, you consider rules to be impediments in your lifestyle, in your evolution and everything else. Like, remember the COVID, when the government tells you wear masks, the first thing that people think here is like, probably the government wants something from us that we don't want to do because we don't know the full picture. So we would rather not. And we brought these two aspects of our national kind of history, if you want, into the modern times. And I think it's just taking some time to reevaluate our possibility to control our government and not to perceive it as something hostile. So for that reason, I don't see corruption as something, that is just characteristical to the Ukrainian character, in terms of that the Ukrainians cannot live without it. No, we are changing, we're evolving very much so. I think that we have implemented all of the possible recommendations from our international partners, starting with NABU, NAZK, and other international institutions, the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office, the Anti-Corruption Agency, the Asset Assessment Agency, and so on and so forth. Did that help? It did. I mean, do we still have corruption? Of course we do. Any country does. Is it at some incredible scale? No, it's not. Because otherwise, I mean, If you take just, for instance, the Poles, and I'm the person who talks a lot to some business associations here, including foreign businesses that still conduct their operations in Ukraine. If you would ask them what are the main risks and the main problems they face, name top 10. Corruption would be number 6, number 7, perhaps sometimes even number 8. I mean, you have Inditex reopening their operations here. You have Nestle reopening their operations here. You have Philip Morris reopening their operations here. You have British companies. You have American companies. You have Rheinmetall right now setting up their offices here. Would they do that if it would be just some outrageous level of corruptions? No. So in a way, I think it's a mix of, I don't have to be diplomatic here, do I? No. I very often see that people, especially our partners sometimes, use this argument of corruption the way they want to justify the absence of actions from their side. And it's the easier thing to do. Just, well, you are just too corrupted. Well, it's like when I was in the UK just a week ago. I've been meeting some very big corporations on your side. And some of them have already opened their offices and production lines in Ukraine. Others are considering to do so. And they have made a public commitment. But there was one company in particular, I wouldn't say for the reasons of ethics. And it's a big company. And they told me, listen, yeah, we've done so much. And I was like, yeah, we are very appreciative, but we would very much appreciate if you could open your production facilities here in Ukraine. In terms of logistics, that would be much easier in terms of, your access towards the R&D results and everything. And they told us, no, the risks are too big. The war risks. Like, yeah, but we've just been to that company and this company and the third company. They're already operating. Like, yeah, but then you have corruption. Okay, you can be that. You can win at that game, So for that reason, I'm not saying there is no corruption in Ukraine. I mean, obviously, we're hearing about this in the news, but the good thing is that we will learn how to react rather quickly. I mean, the moment that we learned about corruption in the MSAC, the medical evaluation system that basically issues the certificates on whether you are a handicapped person or you aren't, it was dismantled, like all of the authority immediately. And there's a number of criminal cases that have been opened after that. Was just impressive. So yes, we do have it. But again, I hardly can imagine any country that can say, no, we're corruption free. We have no corruption. The important thing is that the corruption that it is here is not at the level that is affecting business operations and the reforms that we are having. That would be my answer.
You gave a very eloquent, possibly the most eloquent I've ever heard of why corruption happens in the sense of ordinary people. And I totally can accept the arguments you've made. But of course, many people would argue that the most torturous examples of corruption and most harmful are at the very top of societies historically, and indeed Ukraine's, with oligarchs and everything else. So how do you explain that? That's surely just greed, is it not? That's not them trying to scrape a living because the state's out against them. That's
no, absolutely. That's just an absence of understanding what this country means to you. That's it. They're not patriots. Yeah, I don't think they know a word like patriot. Because, I mean, those people were born in the USSR in a way, not in a way, like physically. I was born in the USSR, but I was lucky enough to be 4 years old when it all collapsed. So I was raised as a Ukrainian. They were raised as person belonging to some ultra national kind of unity of nations, and then it all collapsed and there is a void. So who are you now? And where is your heart? Where is your soul? Like the ancestries, yeah, but the Soviet Union, starting from the 1919, I think, was trying to teach you that you're a Soviet man. So in a way, I think that what happened, and I can tell you that probably I had these discussions with some people that one might call an oligarch, is that at a certain moment they just saw an opportunity and they seized it because there is no authority, There is no government, at least strong enough to control you for some time, from the 1991 until the early 2000s. And everything is there for taking, So why, in their words, why wouldn't you? If that was legal for me, I would do that. And so for them, it wasn't about doing some communal good, doing something very, very helpful for their compatriots or whatever. They didn't know there was the word compatriot. you know what I'm trying to say? They were formed mentally in times of deficit, in times of limitations. And now all of a sudden they have this opportunity to get huge amounts of money and to compensate psychologically the deficit by owning an incredibly lavish villas, lifestyle, yachts, cars, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't about patriotism. For them, it was just, this is a place where we can get our access to and control the most lucrative resources. So wonderful, let's do that. Unfortunately, it wasn't the same kind of people as it was, Vanderbilt, for instance, or Rockefeller back in the United States, because in a way they had a very similar circumstances, right? But those were the people who were descendants of the pioneers who came to America, and then they were trying to craft this American way of life and so on and so forth. Here, nothing similar happened. It was just one system collapsed, void of power, huge opportunities to control literally incredible amounts and chunks of the economy and industry, become monopolists in those. So, of course, it was there for the taking.
Fascinating. Well, I'll ask you for your final thoughts in a moment, where if there's anything we haven't discussed, you can raise it. But I've just got one other question. I know you, in your student days, were fascinated by China, and I'm interested in your perspective on China and its role in this war and its role in the future relationship with Ukraine.
So this might sound surprising, but until recently, and I need to check this again and to update myself, but perhaps even today, China is probably one of the top 2 trade partners of Ukraine. So for us, having good trade relationships with them was vital. And of course, it doesn't really help to our relationships the fact that we find a lot of loopholes that the Russians are using with the help of some Chinese infrastructure, let's call it like this, when they do circumvent the sanctions. So in terms of China, I think for them, this war is also a very interesting showcase of the future of their region. For instance, I know this from a good friend of mine who spent some considerable amount of time in China, and he speaks Chinese, and he gets along with them quite well. That the fact that, for instance, the North Koreans have launched a missile quite recently was a shock to both, not just the West, but to China as well, because they didn't see it coming, that Russia was so instrumental to the Koreans to develop their space programs, the nuclear program, the rocket program, and so on and so forth. And that is changing the dynamics in the region. This is one aspect. Second thing, and this is where I have to get back to my Cambridge times again. So we mentioned Keynes. Now I want to mention another guy, the philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein. So, you just can't leave the place without learning about 2 of them, right?
Well, I did my dissertation on Wittgenstein, so it's music to my ears, Dmytro.
Thank you. And is it called logocentrism?
Logical positivism, coming from the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus.
Logical positivism. So, and to put it very simply, I'm not by far an expert, and I didn't do any dissertations, but in terms for everyone to understand it, I wouldn't probably make a mistake if I would say that in his worldview, words matter a lot. Right?
Yes.
So the way you phrase, the way you position your language, it creates a reality in a way.
Yeah.
And
the limits of language are the limits of my world, is the phrase that's often used.
Absolutely. And with this in mind, I think, and having China here, I think this war is very important in terms of how do we see and how do we frame the ending of it. What I mean. is the following. So I think we are making a mistake, us, when we are saying that we should get Ukraine back to its territories of 1991. In my opinion, the right way to say it is that we should get Russia back to its territories of 1991. Because if you change that simple wording, it turns out that it's not Ukraine's problem anymore. Because Ukraine never changed its borders. Russia is the only country that deliberately changed its borders at the cost of another country's territory, has fixed it in the constitution and said, deal with it. Now, if we accept that reality, that has happened, and we can see it on the ground, then basically we should ask the whole world the question whether the system that was built in 1945 still stands, and whether the world is okay with allowing one country to deliberately change its borders at the expense of another sovereign country's territory and just say, listen, guys, you just deal with it. I consider this mine. And, so this sends a very wrong signal there to China. Because if we let it happen, and this goes way back to your question to the negotiations, that if China sees, for instance, that Russia is successful in claiming some territories that wasn't Russia's before and getting away with it, then not just China, but any other major power that has some territorial claims. Another thing is that, in a way, I think in 2022, it all started as, and before I go there, another fascinating observation was, in terms of how you use words, was a trip to Italy during our Ukrainian counteroffensive. And I met a good friend of mine, an old friend. We know each other quite some time. And I asked him, listen, do I have a feeling that you guys have some problems with supporting Ukraine at the moment? Like, because you were rather supportive all the time. Now I don't see too much of an excitement no more. And he told me, yes, because you're doing the counteroffensive. I was like, what's wrong with that? He said, because you are counter-offending. So you're not on the defense anymore. You are the new offenders. Like, are you kidding me? He said, no, that's important to us. Like, now you are the attacking party. Like, that's very weird. We're getting back the territories, we're liberating what is ours. We're getting, yeah, but like the linguistics matter here. So for our people, it's very hard to support some offense. So defense, that's fine. Offense, no. So incredible in terms how it affects, the perception of the reality. That's absolutely incredible. And another kind of way China looks at this war. Do technologies matter? How do they matter? Can a country with less population still outperform against a country with more population? So in a way, this way of looking at it and the recent entrance into this war of the North Korean soldiers, they remind me of this, the Spanish Civil War of the 30s, when everyone was sending the troops there just to learn. To see
before the Second World War really kicked
absolutely.
off. Well, we've come to the end of our time, Dmytro. So interesting hearing your reflections, which are quite unique actually, and I think that's really will be appreciated by our audience. Is there anything we haven't covered that you would like to mention, or even just a message for those listening around the world?
No. I just wanted to say thank you. Really, it's been a very hard time for us, but we always know that you are there. You are supporting us, not just with your words, with your actions, with your hospitality, with your weapons, with your humanitarian assistance, with everything. And it matters a great deal to us. We are really very much thankful, and we are very much appreciative. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your time today, Dmytro.
Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, There is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Alexis Adimora. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.